June 23, 1944. German commanders across Belarus closed their eyes that night, believing one thing above all else: their fortified lines would stand unbroken for months to come. When dawn arrived, their entire front had been erased from existence. History obsesses over the beaches of Normandy. Yet somehow the world forgot about something far more catastrophic. The day 2.4 million Soviet soldiers orchestrated the disappearance of 500,000 German troops as if they'd never existed at all. This isn't just another chapter from the Second World War. This is the untold story of the most devastating military deception ever executed. A masterpiece of illusion that rewrote the rules of modern warfare. By summer 1944, Army Group Center gripped Belarus like an iron vice. A massive German fist thrust deep into Soviet territory. Wehrmacht strategists called it the Belarusian balcony, and Hitler himself transformed its cities into impenetrable strongholds. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk each designated a festung, a fortress city that would never fall. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded this formidable force. Over 500,000 battle-hardened combat troops backed by 300,000 support personnel. They controlled the primary invasion route to Moscow itself. For 3 brutal years, they'd held this ground against everything Stalin could throw at them. German military intelligence remained absolutely convinced of one strategic certainty: the next major Soviet offensive would strike Ukraine. Their reconnaissance aircraft captured thousands of photographs showing massive Red Army buildups throughout the southern sector. Endless columns of tanks, forests of artillery pieces. Entire armies preparing for battle. Hitler's response was swift and decisive. He stripped Belarus of reserves, sending every available division racing southward to Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Minsk, German officers attended elegant opera performances. They hosted elaborate dinner parties. One colonel penned a letter to his wife that would later haunt military historians. "The Russians are finished here. We observe their gathering forces in the south, but they lack the strength to threaten our positions." But here's the truth those confident German officers couldn't possibly fathom. At that precise moment, 1.7 million Soviet soldiers lay concealed in the dense Belarusian forests. Hidden, silent, invisible, less than 30 miles from German defensive lines. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky commanded the northern forces. Marshal Zhukov, the legendary Soviet strategist, coordinated the entire operation from Moscow. They'd been assembling this colossal force for 3 full months, right under German noses. The Wehrmacht had constructed their entire defensive strategy around intelligence that was fundamentally catastrophically wrong. The question becomes almost impossible to answer. How does any military force conceal 2.4 million soldiers, 5,200 tanks, 36,000 artillery pieces, and 70,000 vehicles from enemy reconnaissance? The Soviets had invested 3 years perfecting their answer. They called it maskirovka. The sophisticated art of military deception raised to unprecedented levels. Every single night, Soviet tank columns crept forward through the darkness. Before the first rays of dawn could expose their movements, thousands of soldiers swept away every track, every trace, using pine branches as makeshift brooms. When German reconnaissance flights arrived at sunrise, their cameras captured only pristine forest floors, untouched snow, peaceful countryside. Colonel General Sergei Shtimenko personally inspected these sweeping operations night after night. One overlooked tank tread, one careless footprint, could unravel the entire operation and doom millions. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, where German intelligence expected the decisive blow, Soviet engineers constructed something extraordinary. An entire phantom army materialized across the landscape. They built 85,000 dummy vehicles. Inflatable tanks that appeared completely authentic from reconnaissance altitude. Wooden artillery pieces painted with meticulous detail. Elaborate fake fuel depots assembled from painted barrels positioned precisely to cast realistic shadows. They even established phantom headquarters complete with radio transmissions. Soviet radio operators broadcast fake orders using encryption codes they knew German intelligence had already broken. Rush ammunition supplies to Sector 12 immediately. Tank Battalion 45 requires fuel within 6 hours. Every word a calculated lie. German analysts documented everything, building detailed intelligence reports based on pure fiction. The real Soviet forces maintained absolute radio silence. Not one transmission. Not one word. Behind German lines, partisan fighters like Fyodor Kovbuk severed communication cables throughout the region. They mapped every German position, reporting coordinates directly to Moscow. When the assault finally came, German commanders couldn't call for reinforcements, couldn't request air support, couldn't even warn neighboring units of the catastrophe engulfing them. Soviet soldiers endured strict communication blackouts. No letters home, no personal messages. Private Mikhail Frolov later recalled the psychological toll. For 2 endless months, my mother believed I was dead. We couldn't send any word, any sign of life. We simply waited in those forests, invisible, non-existent. German reconnaissance flights photographed thousands of square miles. Every image confirmed their assumptions: massive Soviet forces concentrating in Ukraine, empty forests throughout Belarus. Years later, a German intelligence officer would make a haunting confession. We photographed exactly what they intended us to see. We were strategically blind, deaf, and completely helpless. June 22nd. Exactly 3 years to the day after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, Soviet reconnaissance units probed German defensive lines with small-scale attacks. Minor engagements. Nothing particularly threatening. German commanders observed these skirmishes with amusement. They dismissed them as symbolic harassment, theatrical gestures marking the invasion anniversary. They couldn't have been more catastrophically wrong. June 23, 1944, 4 a.m. The forest exploded into violence. 170 Soviet divisions launched simultaneous attacks across 450 miles of front. The artillery barrage achieved such overwhelming intensity that German soldiers positioned just 20 meters behind the front lines couldn't hear their own desperate screams. This wasn't conventional warfare. This was annihilation on an industrial scale. Soviet tank columns didn't waste time reducing German strongpoints. They flowed around resistance like water rushing past stones, encircling, bypassing, isolating. Within hours, entire German divisions found themselves cut off from supplies, surrounded, trapped in rapidly closing pockets. Field Marshal Busch seized his telephone with trembling hands. He placed an emergency call to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. "We require immediate permission to conduct strategic withdrawal." Hitler's response consisted of exactly one word: Nein. Mean Führer, without retreat, we will lose the entire army group. Every fortress city will hold its position, not one step backward. By noon, Soviet armored spearheads had penetrated 20 miles into German positions. By nightfall, 35 miles. The Wehrmacht's elite 3rd Panzer Army found itself completely encircled at Vitebsk. General Friedrich Gallwitzer commanded 35,000 men in that doomed pocket. Within 48 hours, only 8,000 remained alive or uncaptured. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available aircraft to provide support, but Soviet fighters dominated the skies with overwhelming numerical superiority. 6,000 Soviet aircraft against 40 operational German fighters. Luftwaffe pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel recorded the horror. "We launched with 12 aircraft. 3 returned." Marshal Rokossovsky's tank armies achieved speeds that shattered German understanding of mechanized warfare. 50 miles in 3 days. Faster than the Wehrmacht's own legendary advance during their 1941 invasion. One German officer transmitted a final radio message before his position was overrun. "They're everywhere, behind us, beside us, inside our lines." How did they penetrate so impossibly fast? Private Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 267th Infantry Division kept a personal diary throughout the campaign. His June 25th entry reveals the psychological collapse. Russians materialize from nowhere, from the earth itself. Captain Muller shot himself rather than face capture. Those of us still mobile are retreating west. Anyone who cannot run gets abandoned to their fate. At Bobruisk, 70,000 German troops found themselves in a rapidly contracting trap. General Gotthard Heinrici commanded the doomed garrison. He formally requested permission to attempt a breakout while escape corridors still existed. Hitler's response remained unchanged. Bobruisk is designated a fortress. Fortresses do not retreat. Hitler stared at operational maps in his East Prussian headquarters, visualizing his fortress cities as immovable rocks that would shatter the Soviet offensive. He was catastrophically, fatally wrong. Those cities became mass graves. At Bobruisk, Soviet artillery transformed the city into absolute hell. Private Heinz Koch managed to write one final letter before communications ceased entirely. "The entire city burns without end. Russian shells arrive every minute, every second. We have no food remaining, no medical supplies, no hope." The wounded scream throughout the nights. Command continues ordering us to hold. Hold what exactly? Nothing remains but ashen corpses. General Heinrici understood his men faced certain death if they remained trapped. On June 27th, he committed an act of military insubordination. He directly disobeyed the Führer, ordering an immediate breakout attempt. 35,000 men tried desperately to escape the Bobruisk pocket. Soviet tanks and aircraft slaughtered them in the open countryside. Only 15,000 reached German lines alive. Soviet combat photographers filmed the aftermath, mountains of German corpses stretching across fields, hundreds of burned-out tanks and vehicles creating mechanical graveyards. One cameraman wrote in his journal, "I filmed 3 years of unimaginable war. I have never witnessed destruction on this scale." Vitebsk fell on June 26th. Orsha collapsed on June 27th. Mogilev surrendered on June 28th. Every fortress city Hitler declared must stand forever fell within days. Then Soviet forces converged on the ultimate prize, Minsk. Minsk functioned as Army Group Center's primary logistics hub. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every bandage, every replacement soldier passed through this critical city. On July 3rd, just 11 days after the offensive erupted, Soviet tanks rolled through Minsk streets unopposed. 100,000 German soldiers now found themselves trapped east of the city. No supplies, no fuel, no ammunition, no hope of survival. Field Marshal Busch flew personally to Hitler's headquarters. He pleaded on his knees, "Allow them to retreat while any possibility of survival remains." Hitler fired him immediately. He replaced Busch with Field Marshal Walter Model, known throughout the Wehrmacht as the Führer's fireman, a commander legendary for salvaging desperate situations. But even Model's tactical genius couldn't extinguish this inferno. He arrived to discover Army Group Center had lost 31 of its 47 generals, killed in action or captured by Soviet forces. Model transmitted one brutally honest message to Hitler: Army Group Center no longer exists as an effective fighting force. Within 2 weeks, proud Wehrmacht divisions that had conquered France, Yugoslavia, Greece were reduced to starving bands of desperate survivors. They discarded weapons to move faster. They stripped boots from Soviet corpses. They stumbled westward, searching for German lines that no longer existed anywhere on their maps. Stalin wanted the entire world to witness what the Red Army had accomplished. On July 17, 1944, Moscow witnessed an event unprecedented in human history. 57,000 German prisoners marched through the capital's streets in an orchestrated display of Soviet victory. They walked 20 soldiers abreast. The column required 90 minutes to pass completely. These weren't ordinary captured soldiers. The formation included 19 German generals, men who once commanded entire armies, who had ordered the deaths of millions. Soviet citizens lined the streets in absolute silence. Some spat at the passing Germans. Some threw stones and debris. Most simply stared, bearing witness to the men who had brought unspeakable horror to their homeland. These were the invaders responsible for 27 million Soviet deaths. Now they shuffled through Moscow like ghosts, broken, defeated, erased. Journalist Vasily Grossman observed from Red Square. He recorded his thoughts. They walked with eyes fixed on the pavement. No pride remaining, no defiance, no hope, just endless gray columns of the utterly defeated. After the last prisoner passed, street cleaning trucks followed the procession. They sprayed water and disinfectant across the pavement, washing away the Nazi presence. The symbolism resonated powerfully. The German invasion was being erased, cleansed, removed from Soviet soil. The statistical reality of Operation Bagration remains staggering even 80 years later. In just 5 weeks, Soviet forces completely destroyed Army Group Center. 450,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured. 31 divisions eliminated from existence. The Wehrmacht suffered greater losses in 5 weeks than during 5 months at Stalingrad. Soviet armies advanced 450 miles westward. They liberated all of Belarus. They reached Poland's borders, and for the first time since 1941, Soviet soldiers stood at the threshold of German territory itself. A captured German general, Friedrich Gallwitzer, told his interrogators something that reveals the operation's true genius. "We never imagined deception on such scale was even theoretically possible. You manipulated our attention precisely where you desired. When we finally recognized the truth, nothing could be done." The Red Army had transformed completely. The force that nearly collapsed in 1941 had become unstoppable. They'd absorbed German tactical innovations, blitzkrieg encirclement, deep penetration, but enhanced them with massive scale deception and overwhelming material superiority. Private Mikhail Frolov, who had hidden silently in those forests for months, finally wrote home to his mother, We did it. Mama. We destroyed them completely. Berlin awaits us next. Operation Bagration achieved what Stalingrad and Kursk had initiated. It shattered the Wehrmacht's spine. It proved the Red Army had become Earth's most powerful military force. Yet today, every schoolchild learns about D-Day. The largest land battle of the entire war remains largely forgotten throughout the Western world. Perhaps because it forces us to acknowledge an uncomfortable historical truth. The war's outcome wasn't determined on Normandy's beaches. It was decided in the forests of Belarus, where Soviet mastery of deception and overwhelming force created a trap so perfect, so complete, that an entire German army group simply vanished into history. The Germans went to sleep confident in their defensive superiority. They awakened to absolute annihilation. In 23 days, 500,000 men ceased to exist as a fighting force, all because they looked exactly where Stalin wanted them to look. The greatest magic trick in military history, and the world barely remembers it happened.